The photograph Freddie Mercury kept hidden for 11 years and the hero he never had the courage to meet. Garden Lodge, London, November 1991. While organizing Freddie Mercury's personal belongings after his death, Mary Austin found something that made her stop completely. Tucked inside a drawer beneath silk scarves and unopened letters was a small black and white photograph. Not of family, not of lovers, not even of Queen. It was John Lennon. The photograph was worn at the edges from being handled, creased from being carried. The kind of wear that comes from years of looking at something when nobody else is watching. Mary had lived with Freddie for years, knew his secrets, understood his private world, but she'd never known about this photograph or what it meant, until she found the diary entry from December 9th, 1980, the day after Lennon was shot. 3 words written in Freddie's handwriting, shaking so badly the ink bled. I've lost him. Not the world lost him. Not music lost him. I've lost him. This is the story of Freddie Mercury's secret obsession with John Lennon, the hero he worshipped but never met, the photograph he kept hidden for over a decade, and the song he wrote in 1982 that was actually a funeral dirge for a man he'd loved from a distance but never had the courage to approach. Because sometimes the brightest stars in the world still need someone else's light to navigate by. And for Freddie Mercury, that light came from a man who died before they could ever shake hands. December 8th, 1980, Monday night, news was breaking across the world that John Lennon had been shot outside the Dakota Building in New York City, dead at age 40, murdered by a fan who'd asked for an autograph hours earlier. In London, Freddie Mercury was at home in his Kensington flat when the phone started ringing. Friends calling to see if he'd heard, journalists wanting a quote about the loss to music, everyone assuming Freddie would have something theatrical to say, some grand statement befitting rock royalty. Freddie didn't answer the phone. He locked his bedroom door and didn't come out for 16 hours. His assistant Peter Freestone stood outside that door for most of the night, listening to complete silence. No music playing, no sounds of crying, just absolute quiet that somehow felt worse than any outburst. I've never heard Freddie be that silent, Peter later recalled. Even in sleep, he made noise humming, moving, existing loudly. But that night, it was like he disappeared into himself completely. What nobody knew, what even Peter didn't know at the time, was that Freddie wasn't just mourning a musical icon. He was grieving someone he'd considered a spiritual guide, a creative North Star, the one artist whose work made him feel less alone in understanding what performance and authenticity cost. When Freddie finally emerged the next morning, his eyes were red but dry. He looked like someone who'd cried themselves into exhaustion hours ago and had nothing left. He walked past Peter without speaking, went straight to the kitchen, and made tea with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the kettle. Peter started to say something, some platitude about what a loss this was for everyone. Freddie cut him off. Don't. Please. I can't hear about what everyone lost. Not today. That was the first indication that Freddie's relationship with John Lennon, though entirely one-sided and conducted from a distance, went deeper than anyone around him had understood. The truth was that Freddie Mercury had been quietly obsessed with John Lennon for over a decade, not in a competitive way or even a particularly public way, but in a deeply personal way that he kept almost entirely hidden. In the 1970s, when Queen was building their reputation on theatrical rock operas and elaborate productions, Freddie would come home after stadium shows and listen to Lennon's solo work. Imagine. Mother. God. The stripped-down, brutally honest songs that were the complete opposite of everything Queen was creating. Brian May noticed this once, walking past Freddie's room late at night after a sold-out performance and hearing John Lennon's voice coming from inside. Not Queen celebrating their success, just Freddie, alone, listening to someone else's truth. It confused me at first, Brian said years later. We'd just played to 70,000 people. Freddie had owned that stage completely, and then he'd come home and listen to Lennon singing about pain and isolation, like he was searching for something our success wasn't providing. What Freddie was searching for was permission to be real. Lennon's work represented something Freddie desperately wanted, but felt incapable of creating. Unfiltered emotional honesty without theatrical armor. There's a quote Freddie gave in a 1977 interview that most people miss the significance of. The journalist asked what artist he most admired. Freddie's answer came quickly: John Lennon. Because he says things plainly, and people still listen. I dress everything up in costume and drama because I'm terrified of what plain truth sounds like. The journalist wrote it down but didn't push further, assuming it was just Freddie being characteristically self-deprecating. But it wasn't self-deprecation. It was confession. Freddie believed Lennon possessed something he lacked: the courage to be artistically naked, to write songs that weren't performances but raw admissions, to stand on stage and sing about fear and weakness without hiding behind spectacle. And the cruelest irony was that Freddie had multiple opportunities to meet John Lennon but never took them. In 1974, both Queen and Lennon were recording in London during the same period. They used studios in the same building, just floors apart. Mutual friends suggested introductions. Someone even arranged for them to potentially meet at a label party. Freddie made excuses every time. Too busy. Wrong timing. Maybe next week. The truth, which he admitted years later to a close friend, was that he was terrified of meeting Lennon. Terrified of being disappointed if Lennon was ordinary in person, but more terrified of confirming what he suspected: that he'd never measure up to the standard of artistic honesty that Lennon represented. I'd rather worship him from a distance, Freddie told Brian during a vulnerable late-night conversation in 1979, than meet him and have him see through all my costumes to the frightened person underneath. Brian tried to reassure him that Lennon would appreciate Freddie's artistry, understand the different approach they each took to music. But Freddie shook his head. He'd see what I am, Brian. A performer pretending to be an artist. And I don't think I could survive knowing he saw that. So Freddie kept his admiration private, collected Lennon's records, studied his lyrics, kept that small black and white photograph where he could look at it when doubt became overwhelming. And then, December 8th, 1980 happened, and the opportunity to ever meet his hero vanished permanently. The weeks after Lennon's death were strange for everyone who knew Freddie. He didn't talk about it, didn't make public statements, went back to work with Queen almost immediately. But people close to him noticed changes. He was quieter between takes, spent more time alone at the piano, started writing songs that were simpler, more stripped down than Queen's usual elaborate compositions. In early 1982, during sessions for the Hot Space album, Freddie brought in a song he'd written alone. No collaboration with the band, just him and a piano late at night in his home. The song was called Life is Real, Song for Lennon. When he played it for the band, the room went completely quiet, because it wasn't a typical Queen song. It was sparse, almost painfully simple. Just piano and Freddie's voice, no elaborate production, no theatrical flourishes. And the lyrics were as close to emotionally naked as Freddie Mercury had ever allowed himself to be. He sang about loss and reality and the gap between the persona you present to the world and the person you actually are. Sang about admiring someone from a distance, about worshiping a kind of honesty you don't possess yourself. The final lines referenced Lennon directly, but also spoke to Freddie's own mortality and the masks he wore. Life is real, but so is death, and we were only pretending. Roger Taylor later described hearing that song for the first time as watching Freddie remove armor in front of us. He wasn't performing. He was confessing something we didn't know he carried. The song was recorded and included on the album. It wasn't a hit. Most people didn't understand it or connect it to Lennon specifically. Reviews called it uncharacteristically subdued and lacking Queen's usual energy. But people who knew Freddie understood. This was his funeral dirge for John Lennon. The only way he knew how to say goodbye to someone he'd never actually met. And there's a detail about that recording session that only the engineer remembered years later. Freddie asked to do the final take alone in the studio. No band members present. No producer watching through the glass. Just Freddie and the microphone. He wanted privacy for something, the engineer said. Like the song was a conversation with someone who wasn't in the room, but might somehow be listening anyway. As the 1980s progressed and Freddie's own health began declining, his relationship with Lennon's memory took on new dimensions. He started performing Imagine During Queen shows, unusual because Queen typically only played their own material. Freddie would introduce it simply, "This is by someone much braver than me." Then he'd sing Lennon's words about imagining a world without divisions, without barriers, without the need for personas and pretense. People in the audience just saw Freddie Mercury covering a classic song. But band members and crew noticed something different. Freddie's eyes would close during Imagine in a way they didn't during any other performance. His voice would soften. The theatrical performer would disappear, and something quieter, more vulnerable would emerge. After one particularly emotional performance of Imagine in 1986, Freddie walked off stage and immediately sat down, breathing hard. Not from vocal exertion, but from emotional exhaustion. Peter Freestone brought him water. Freddie took it but didn't drink, just stared at nothing for several minutes. Finally he said, almost whispering, "I'm closer to him now, just a few more steps." Peter didn't understand at the time, thought Freddie meant closer to achieving Lennon's level of artistic honesty. Only later, much later, after Freddie died in November 1991, did Peter realize what Freddie actually meant. Closer to death, closer to whatever comes after, closer to potentially meeting the hero he'd never had courage to approach in life. In Freddie's final months, as AIDS ravaged his body and he knew the end was approaching, people noticed the Lennon photograph reappeared. It had always been private, hidden, but now it sat on Freddie's bedside table at Garden Lodge. Jim Hutton, Freddie's partner, asked about it once. Why that particular photograph? Why Lennon specifically? Freddie's answer was simple. He showed me it's possible to be honest and still be extraordinary. I never managed it myself, but he showed me it was possible. The photograph showed Lennon in the mid-1970s, during his Lost Weekend period. Not staged or posed, just a candid shot of a person looking directly at the camera with an expression that was neither smiling nor sad. Just real. Freddie died on November 24, 1991, 11 years and 16 days after John Lennon. When Mary Austin and others were organizing his belongings, that photograph was one of the things Freddie had specifically indicated should be kept private. Not sold, not displayed, just respected as something that mattered to him personally. But the photograph itself wasn't the only evidence of this hidden obsession. In Freddie's personal journals kept private until excerpts were shared decades later, there were multiple references to Lennon. Little observations, lyrics he admired, moments where Freddie questioned his own artistic choices compared to Lennon's approach. One entry from 1983 read, "Watched interview with Lennon from 1970. He was asked why his songs became simpler, less produced. He said, 'Because I'm trying to tell the truth, and truth doesn't need decoration. I've spent 15 years decorating. What truth am I hiding?'" Another from 1988. "Listen to Mother again. Still can't understand how someone can be that vulnerable in front of millions. I've made a career of never being vulnerable. Maybe that's why I'm exhausted." And one final entry from 1991, just months before Freddie's death. "If there's anything after this, I hope he's there. I hope I get the chance to tell him what his honesty meant to someone who couldn't achieve it himself. I hope he'll forgive me for being a coward who loved him from a distance." Brian May spoke about this hidden aspect of Freddie's inner life years after his death. "Freddie was the most confident performer I ever knew. On stage, he owned the world. But privately, he carried this deep insecurity about artistic authenticity. Lennon represented everything Freddie wished he could be brave enough to attempt." The tragedy wasn't just that they never met. It was that Freddie never understood that his own brand of theatrical honesty, using spectacle to express emotions too big for plain words, was just as valid as Lennon's stripped-down approach. Lennon sang about pain plainly because that's what he needed to do. Freddie dressed pain in costume and spectacle because that's what he needed to do. Both were being honest, just in different languages, but Freddie never believed that. To the end, he saw Lennon as the standard he failed to meet, rather than an alternative path he chose not to follow. There's a recording that surfaced years after Freddie's death, a home tape from 1980, right after Lennon's assassination. Freddie at his piano, playing the opening chords of Imagine over and over, voice barely audible, singing along, stopping frequently as emotion made continuing impossible. At one point on the tape, Freddie stops playing entirely. There's silence. Then his voice, cracked and small. I should have met you. I should have been brave enough just once. Then more silence. Then the piano again, playing the same chords, searching for something that words couldn't express. That's perhaps the saddest part of this story. Freddie Mercury, who commanded stadiums, who created some of rock's most ambitious and successful music, who became an icon of confidence and fearlessness, was too afraid to introduce himself to the one person whose work meant the most to him personally. And John Lennon, who'd spent his career singing about breaking down walls and connecting honestly, never knew that one of his greatest admirers was watching from a distance, too terrified of judgment to step forward. Two legends, same industry, same city at times, multiple opportunities for paths to cross, and a silence neither of them chose to break. When people talk about Freddie Mercury's influences, they mention rock and opera, spectacle and theater, Bowie and Hendrix. Rarely do they mention John Lennon, because Freddie kept that influence hidden, private, sacred. But for those who look closely, who listen to Life is Real, and hear the vulnerability Freddie rarely showed, who noticed the Lennon photograph in descriptions of Garden Lodge, who read the journal entries acknowledging artistic insecurity, the influence is unmistakable. Freddie Mercury spent his career creating elaborate theatrical spectacles that millions adored. But in private moments, late at night, he'd listen to John Lennon singing plainly about fear and pain, and he'd wonder if maybe honesty didn't need costumes at all. He never resolved that question, never found peace with his own approach versus Lennon's, carried that tension right to the end. But perhaps that tension is what made Freddie's work so powerful. The combination of theatrical spectacle and genuine emotion. The way he could sing Bohemian Rhapsody, 6 minutes of operatic excess, and make it feel absolutely true. Maybe that was Freddie's version of honesty. Not Lennon's stripped-down confessions, but truth dressed in costume because some emotions are too overwhelming to present plainly. Lennon taught Freddie that music could be honest. Freddie taught millions that honesty could be theatrical. They never met, never spoke, never collaborated. But somewhere in the space between Imagine and Bohemian Rhapsody, between plain confession and theatrical spectacle, their two approaches to truth met anyway. And that black and white photograph worn from handling, creased from care, kept private for over a decade, was Freddie's way of saying thank you to someone who'd never know they'd been thanked. Sometimes the people who shape us most profoundly are the ones we never have courage to approach. Sometimes worship happens from a distance, and sometimes a small photograph hidden in a drawer carries more weight than any words we never found courage to speak. Freddie Mercury kept John Lennon's photograph for 11 years, looked at it when doubt became overwhelming, found in those black and white eyes some reflection of his own struggle with authenticity and performance. He died never having met his hero, never having told him what his work meant, never having asked the questions he carried for years. But maybe in whatever comes after, if anything comes after, maybe they finally met. Maybe Freddie walked up to Lennon without fear or costume or pretense. Maybe he finally said the words he'd been too afraid to say in life. And maybe Lennon smiled and said what Freddie needed to hear. You were always real, just in your own way. That's what we hope anyway. For Freddie, for everyone who ever worshipped someone from a distance, for anyone who carried a photograph of their hero and wished for courage they couldn't find. The story of Freddie and Lennon isn't about what happened. It's about what didn't happen, but somehow mattered anyway. And that might be the saddest and most beautiful kind of love there is.